in transportation politics in Los Angeles, moral combat, black atheist, gender politics, gender politics, and values wars, and Carabos Americana, race and religious rebels. She is a contributing editor for the Feminist Wire and was named 2013 Secular Woman of the Year. She is a visiting scholar at USC's Center for Feminist Research and the founder of the Women's Leadership Project, a feminist, humanist, high school mentoring program based in South LA. Her novel, White Nights, Black Paradise, based on People's Temple and the Jonestown massacre, is actually due out in a couple of weeks, as I understand it. And I think we might even, she'll talk about that some more later. Anyway, please help me give a very warm welcome to Sikivu Hutchinson. And you are live.
Okay, great. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, great to be here in a humanist community center. What a concept. Yeah. We don't have these in LA. Okay. Maybe some technical issues, Richard?
Yes. We are dead. What's going on?
Yeah, well, the laptop is on. It's just a connection. Okay, we're good.
Still having technical difficulties?
No, I think we're good.
Okay.
Okay. All right, I'll just do it from the laptop. No one ever discussed Trayvon Martin with us in class. This was something that one of my students named Sydney, who's actually in the front with the glasses, said during a discussion that we were having about Trayvon Martin's murder and its impact on the criminal justice system with my Young Male Scholars Program youth, who are predominantly African American. Young Male Scholars was piloted at a high school in South Los Angeles called Gardena High School. This is a campus where African Americans are second in population to Latino students, but African American males are a rarity in the college center at this particular school. And this is where we were having the discussion. A rarity because they are frequently left to their own devices academically, not viewed as being college material, college ready, either pounced on by military recruiters or rounded up by law enforcement on campus, school police, and community police. We have several jurisdictions represented on this particular campus. And this is the recurring theme in criminalization of youth of color in an exceptionalist nation that prides itself on being the so-called beacon of prosperity and equal opportunity. There's a passage in the book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, and some of you may be familiar with the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, where she chronicles the journey of African Americans from the South to the North, what was dubbed the Great Migration during the 20th century. And she says that the people did not cross the turnstiles of Ellis Island. They were already citizens. But where they came from, they were not treated as such. And it's not a stretch to say that Ellis Island for white European immigrants was something of a way station and a proving ground, allowing them to shed the stain of their ethnic otherness and transition into whiteness, into Americanness, by assuming new names, new identities, and new zip codes that were systematically denied African American citizens. Secularism played a key role in this inauguration, in this grand rite of passage, because in assuming Enlightenment ideals and values, and assuming the so-called American religion of rugged individualism and free enterprise and liberal democracy, or really plutocracy, and assuming the values of rationalism, these European immigrants, others within the lens of Anglo-Americana, could more profoundly transition and could throw off the shackles of the backward religions and superstitions that supposedly bedevil the so-called old world. Now, white secular worship of the rapist, the slaveholder, and the founding father, Thomas Jefferson, is part and parcel of this mythologizing. Children of color are systematically taught in our American public education classrooms that Jefferson was this morally upright statesman challenging the tyranny, intellectual and political and ideological tyranny of the British Empire, when in fact it was the British who offered African Americans the right of freedom if they fought on the side of England during the Revolutionary War. And yet children of color are indoctrinated in our exceptionalist classrooms to view slavery as this anomaly, to view it as an emblem of the original sin of the South and the South only, rather than what it was, the engine of modern American capitalism on the backs of African Americans, utilizing and exploiting and extracting African American labor and personhood, or lack thereof. And so after the terrorist murders in South Carolina this past summer of the Emanuel 9, there was a lot of backslapping and self-congratulation among white allies, principally in the South Carolina legislature. Some of you may have been watching the scene and the debates where you had even Republicans, even Strom Thurmond's son, crying, rallying around the efforts to remove the Confederate flag. And the ultimate removal of the Confederate flag became this sort of national symbol of catharsis and supposed racial reconciliation. But those of us who do social justice work were wondering where these white allies were when it came to redressing the epidemic of mass incarceration that dehumanizes black youth and other youth of color. Where were these august, stalwart white allies when it came to redressing the epidemic of suspension and expulsion that criminalizes black children in gross numbers and often pipelines them into not just juvenile detention facilities, but adult prisons? Where were these white allies when it came to going to the barricades on the egregious consignment of queer and trans youth to homeless facilities, to foster care, and to juvenile detention facilities, due to, yes, the institutionalization of mandatory minimum sentencing policies that disproportionately ensnare and penalize black and Latino youth, but also to the nexus of transphobia, heterosexism, and homophobia. And so taking down Confederate flags and rallying around that old chestnut of the Confederate white supremacist South is low-hanging fruit for white allies. Just like taking down 10 Commandments displays is low-hanging fruit and easy pickings for white secularists. The tougher nut to crack is infusing humanism with a real racial justice agenda that does not elicit this hysterical pushback from white secularists, a la when I wrote an article this past summer condemning the brutalization of a young African-American girl by a white male police officer in McKinney, Texas. Some of you may be familiar with the horrific image of this young black girl in a bikini sprawled out on the ground being straddled by a white police officer. And so the American Humanist Association published my article in the Humanist Magazine, and it elicited a furor with accusations that I was race baiting, playing the race card, doing an Al Sharpton on training wheels number. And so, with white secular friends like these, who needs fundamentalists? Because let's be clear that when people of color talk about humanism, there's a radical difference between the way in which white secularists conceive of humanism. Because white secularists will never have to worry about being brutalized, much less executed, for thinking, walking, driving, kissing, being while white. We'll never have to worry about being branded as illegal aliens, a la the reactionary fascistic propaganda that's regularly spewed onto the airways by the GOP's crowning clown, fascist, xenophobe, cultural amnesiac, Donald Trump. So, how many of you were tuned into the Democratic presidential debate last week? How many of you were aware that the block of granite has left the building? Does everybody know who I'm talking about? Okay. It was a joke about Lincoln Chafee. And he dubbed himself a block of granite. What many of us heard during that debate were full-throated condemnations by Bernie Sanders, pounding his lectern, red-faced, condemnations about Wall Street and the big banks, condemnations that were parroted by Hillary flip-flop Clinton. What we did not hear was any consciousness about the degree of devastation that Wall Street, the big banks, and capitalism have wreaked upon communities of color in general, and black families, and black women in particular. Black women have a penny to the dollar of white families. And so long before Occupy Wall Street made it fashionable for white progressives to lament the demise of the American dream on the boot heel of capitalism, joblessness, homelessness, foreclosure, mass incarceration, sex abuse to prison pipelining were all realities in communities of color. At 8.7% of LA County's population, African Americans are 50% of its homeless population, 40 to 50% of its incarcerated population, both juvenile and adult, and 30 to 40% of its foster care population. And so the lines for church-based food assistance programs and church-based job assistance programs and job fairs are packed to the gills because of the gravity of economic malaise and depression, not recession, depression in disenfranchised communities of color. So given the gravity of these conditions, what realistically does humanism have to offer to communities of color who are not within the radar of the exceptionalist myth of Americana? Well, let's go back and do a mini history lesson, a reality check. African Americans and Latinos are intractably the most segregated groups in the U.S. Doesn't matter whether or not we're talking about an affluent African American family making six figures, or we're talking about an undocumented Latino family barely at the poverty line. Segregation remains intractable in black and brown communities. 70 years ago, in predominantly African American communities, in South Los Angeles and South Central, which is always portrayed as this bedlam of chaos and pathology. 70 years ago, those were lily white communities. African Americans couldn't buy homes there. Why? Because of the institutionalization of racially restrictive covenants authorized by the Federal Housing Administration, sometimes violently and terroristically enforced by nice white citizens through white homeowners associations. Again, we're talking about the North here, quote unquote. We're talking about west of the Mason-Dixon line, or north rather, of the Mason-Dixon line. So the issue is that you had ordinary, average white citizens going around patrolling and doing blockbusting to ensure that you didn't have this mass descent of African American home buyers coming in to their enclaves. Fast forward into the 21st century, and some of these same areas where whites fled in abject terror are now being repopulated by new white homeowners. And this is leading to the displacement of African American and Latino home buyers. And so what do the economics of white privilege and white supremacy look like in segregated America? Well, it looks like some of the things I've already talked about. Mass incarceration and prison pipelining for Black and Latino youth, stop and frisk policies for Black and Latino youth, a lack of recreational centers, living wage job centers, park spaces, green spaces, humanist community centers, and the reverse in white working class and white middle class communities. And so circling back to this issue of the primacy and the power of organized religion in communities of color, even free thinkers, staunch, free-thinking, critical intellectuals like Zora Neale Hurston, a novelist and a secular humanist, even secular humanists of African descent, knew full well the seduction and the power of organized religion for African Americans in a context where, here in the 21st century, with a Black president in the White House, you can turn on the TV and see a Black woman being beaten within an inch of her life by a police officer. And this is a reference to a case that occurred in LA in 2014 with an African American homeless woman named Marlene Pinnock, who was beaten within an inch of her life on the side of a highway in Los Angeles by a California Highway Patrol officer. And it happened to be captured by a citizen videographer. And so in my book, Moral Combat, I talk about these traditions of Black radical humanism and the degree to which activists and thinkers and leaders like James Baldwin and Nella Larson, forerunning African-American Harlem Renaissance era author, Langston Hughes, the poet, Richard Wright, Hubert Henry Harrison, staunch communist and atheist, Hurston, of course, Frederick Douglass, human rights abolitionist, A. Philip Randolph, human rights activist and the founder of the March on Washington movement. This broad spectrum of African-American secular humanists coming to humanism from different points and different spheres of radical activism, but all steeping their humanism within a critical consciousness about an investment in Black liberation struggle, both domestically and internationally, and all conscious of the fact that Christianity, yes, had provided African Americans with a platform for radical resistance, for challenging the structures of white supremacist oppression, authority, and control, which said that democracy should be vested onto white landed men, which said that rationalism was the province of Europeans. Christianity afforded African Americans with a platform to deconstruct those paradoxes of ideology. It also provided African Americans with a venue for resistance, for cultural solidarity. Many of you who are familiar with the history of the Mother Emanuel Church know that that was a platform for slave resistance and slave rebellion. And so I grew up in a community and a household that I'll characterize as post-60s progressive, where my humanism was shaped by a critical consciousness of the intersection of racism, sexism, and injustice. And in our intensely segregated, predominantly African-American community, police brutality and racial profiling were everyday realities, and there was no separation between humanism and anti-racism. And yes, there were many in the community who prayed on a regular basis, went to church on a regular basis, read the Bible on a regular basis. And we were taught to believe that martyrdom at the hands of whites was a Black male thing when it came to racial injustice. And this was something that was socialized by, yes, the heterosexist, patriarchal Black church. but also by the heterosexist, patriarchal civil rights movement, which did not deem the struggles that confronted African American women as worthy of going to the national barricades for. And yet, one of my earliest memories of going to a political protest was with my father in 1979, after the murder of an African American woman named Eula Love by 2 LAPD officers in South Central LA. And what was most indelible for me about her murder was the fact that this was a black mother killed in cold blood in her home. Home was supposed to be, in the mind of a child at least, safe space and private sanctuary. It was supposed to be within the lens of white middle Americana, the place that girls affirmed and validated their identities. It was supposed to be this iconic space within the blonde trinity of Barbie, Betty Crocker, and the Brady Bunch. And yet, home has always been a source of bitter paradox for black women. After the murder of Trayvon Martin, there was a lot of national discussion about and vilification of sagging pants. And so lo and behold, we have the serviceable specter of the shiftless, lazy, pathological black mother being trotted out to account for why it was that you had so many in the minds of mainstream media, violent, lawless black men and boys committing all these crimes that got them killed. And so this specter, this figure of bad black motherhood has always been marshaled ever since slavery into 1965 with the Moynihan Report, which vilified and demonized the so-called black matriarchy as the font of all of the problems of so-called pathological black communities and black families, into 2009 with the depiction in the movie Precious of yet another iconic, bad, black welfare mother. And so, vilified and constructed as either hypersexual Jezebels or Aunt Jemimas, black women have never been able to serve up America's apple pie unless they were wearing Aunt Jemima's headscarf, have always been marginalized and demonized as not fully human and not fully female. And this was a regime of sexual terrorism and dehumanization that was established under slavery, was codified by a secular constitution, and was nourished in the lap of a Christian nation which gave us this 18th century gem of legalese. Children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother. And if any Christian, i.e. white person, shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he shall pay double the fines of the former act. And so racial slavery in the U.S. was institutionalized on the backs and in the wombs of black women who were brought here as laborers, and then of course as breeders. And this is the critical distinction in socioeconomic and cultural status between black women and white women. And despite the pervasive stereotype of the shiftless, lazy, pathological black mother, black women have the highest workforce representation among all groups of American women. And so when the GOP demonizes Barack Obama as the food stamp president, or demonizes Planned Parenthood and abortion and contraception as the province of sex-crazed sluts, or demonizes public assistance and social welfare, or what remains of social welfare in the U.S., black women's bodies are its silent and secret, not so secret rather, currency. And yet despite the gravity of this climate with regard to the religious right backlash, there are not droves of black women leaving faith and organized religion. Of course, there are greater numbers of African Americans overall who are making the slow transition to secularism, if not atheism, if not humanism, and moving into that nuns column. But the issue for black women remains more intractable because of these stigmas placed upon black female sexuality and black motherhood and the black home. And hence Christianity becomes redemptive for African American women in terms of self-identity, in terms of subjectivity, but also in terms of a role and purchase on the community. The other issue that's problematic, we're talking about the lack of transition space for women of color into secularism, is the fact that the literature on secularism and humanism and atheism is very scant when it comes to truly representing the experiences of women of color, navigating and negotiating racism, sexism, white supremacy, and segregation. Given this, Black Skeptics Los Angeles, which is an organization that I founded 5 years ago, is committed to redressing many of these issues and this gap through the context of public education. And so our question is, how do we broaden humanism to do culturally responsive educational programming that could possibly provide alternatives to organized religion and faith? And this is a picture of our First in the Family Humanist scholars in the first year of our scholarship initiative. Over the past 3 years, Black Skeptics has awarded a number of young people over $20,000 in scholarships coming from the undocumented community, LGBTQ community, homeless community, foster care community, as well as system-involved youth. And so why do we focus on these categories of young people? Because these are the young people, African American, Latino predominantly, who are most vulnerable to being pipelined into permanent incarceration or being pipelined into permanent underemployment or unemployment. African American youth are severely overrepresented in foster care, homeless populations, and juvenile jails. Foster care and homeless youth of color have abysmal college admission rates, much less graduation rates. The percentage is around 11 in terms of graduation. LGBTQ youth of color are more likely, particularly trans and gender non-conforming youth of color, are more likely to be criminalized, more likely to be saddled with the brunt of negative cultural and academic expectations about their outcomes. Undocumented youth obviously have similar patterns of criminalization, profiling, and stereotyping, because when you go to high school campuses, there's not a lot of critical consciousness that resources exist for undocumented youth. And clearly there's no DREAM Act to pipeline undocumented youth into college and provide them with federal financial aid to go to college. Another initiative that Black Skeptics supports is the Women's Leadership Project. This is a program, as Richard announced in my intro, that I founded several years ago. We've been in a number of South LA schools. It's a feminist, humanist mentoring program. It is a college readiness program. We deal primarily with first generation young people who will be the first in their family to go to college. We have an over 95% college going rate, significantly higher than the partner schools where we're based. Our curriculum focuses on reproductive justice, anti-violence prevention, culturally responsive pedagogy. We do a lot of work with AB 540 legislation, trying to increase awareness on our campuses about, again, the college resources and financial aid that are available in-state in California for undocumented young people. And so we focus on empowering young women of color to develop their voices, to foster healthy relationships, and to really develop a critical consciousness about their agency when it comes to activism around prison pipeline, when it comes to the disproportionate impact of criminalization on African American girls in particular. We work with teachers, we work with resource providers, work with administrators, counselors, and parents. And one of our biggest self-identity issues is that we deal with how young women of color internalize the normalization of sexism and misogyny in their daily lives, particularly that with Black women and girls. We have the highest rates of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and HIV/AIDS contraction in the nation. And so prohibitions on black female sexuality mean that as a black girl, you don't get the right and the privilege to twerk on MTV, a la Miley, I twerk, therefore I am Cyrus, and be considered this millennial icon of trailblazing feminism. Black girls don't have that cultural and popular space to do that without being considered HOs. And so the issue is, despite the black male focus that much of national public policy has when it comes to prison pipelining, African American girls have the highest rates of suspension and expulsion in the United States next to black boys. Higher than white boys, higher than Latino boys, higher in many of the data than Native American boys, whose numbers of suspension and expulsion are also off the charts. And yet it's only been very recently that there's been national attention on the criminalization of black girls and women via the Say Her Name movement. This year's First in the Family Humanist Scholars went to youth from all over the country, and this was because we got a lot of support from secular organizations, most notably the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which provided us with a $10,000 grant to give secular youth of color scholarships. Our young people are now at schools like UCLA, UC Riverside, USC, a number of the Cal States, and University of Pittsburgh, University of Texas at Austin. And so when they were asked in their essays, and these are some of our past scholars, about humanist change in their communities, they talked about racial justice, they talked about over-policing, they talked about sexual violence and street harassment, they talked about serving the disabled community. These are the next generation humanist leaders and activists that we must lift up and cultivate if the movement is to survive and truly be a movement of enfranchisement. Writing about her humanist beliefs, University of Pittsburgh-bound winner Adrienne Parks said that one of the things that caused me to shy away from religion was the lack of acceptance of those who are different. Growing up, I felt like an oddball, one of the few black biracial kids in a very white neighborhood. I had dabbled in church as a child, but I kept waiting to hear God answer me, and it never happened. This made no sense to me, so I left and never looked back. In the years following, I would learn that most churches weren't accepting of gays and lesbians, which only affirmed my decision. Many people are using their religion to hurt the LGBTQ community. We see it in people like the Duggars, who are campaigning to stop trans individuals from using gender-appropriate bathrooms, or in the recent cases of businesses using so-called religious freedom to justify not serving gay patrons. I believe that being a humanist and being passionate about equal rights and fostering a positive community will create a much-needed social change. Where do queer youth of color who are homeless or in foster care go to for help and resources? They go to faith institutions. Where do many of our formerly incarcerated youth go to for reentry? They go to faith institutions. Where do LGBTQ, African American and Latino families go to for affirmation? In many instances, they go to progressive faith institutions, some of which they have helped found. The Williams Institute and the Center for American Progress concluded that African American LGBTQ families and individuals are actually more religious than straight African Americans. And so this is a challenge. Secular humanists are non-existent or MIA when it comes to serving queer people of color. And so if humanism and atheism have no explicit justice agenda that speaks directly to the lived experiences, the cultural capital, the community context, and the social history of disenfranchised peoples of color under white supremacist, capitalist, heterosexist patriarchy, and this is a nod to Bell Hooks's coinage, then the Dawkins dude bros will prevail. And instead of, quote, let them eat cake, it will be let them have Darwin Day t-shirts. Thank you. And this is a shameless plug for our Secular Social Justice Conference that's coming up in 2016 in January at Rice University that some of you may be interested in attending. This is an all people of color conference focusing on economic justice, LGBTQ, atheists of color, feminisms of color, humanism and hip hop, and a number of other social justice and gender justice issues. Questions? Comments? Declarations? And I know there's many.
One of the themes that I saw developed in your talk was something that I've been working on for my whole life, and that's the idea that we should not allow young people to drop out of school until they've accomplished an educational objective. If they can't do well in their local academically inclined public school, they should be relocated to an appropriate vocational track where regardless of what they need to be taught, we provide the opportunity for them to learn this before they are allowed to leave what we call compulsory education in the United States. We have compulsory education laws, but yet in most parts of the country that are urban, we let up to 50% of the kids drop out of school with nothing to offer anybody that beside a minimum wage type of job. So I was just wondering what you think of a nationwide policy of not allowing people to simply drop out of school because they feel like it when they're 16.
Well, see, there are a few things that are problematic about this idea that there's a dropout epidemic rather than a push-out epidemic.
Amen.
The push-out epidemic centers on the fact that you have this nexus of zero-tolerance policies where students come in and they're criminalized for the color of their skin, for their sexual orientation, for their perceived disposition, to authority, okay? So there's one issue. The other issue is that you have a regime of high-stakes testing in this nation where drill and kill is the mantra, okay? Rather than trying to instill critical thinking and intellectual rigor and a community of collegiality among students across disciplines, okay? These are the twin drivers of push-out for African American and Latino working class youth in the United States. So I think that there needs to be a paradigm shift in terms of the way people think about these masses of young people that are leaving our school institutions. They're being pushed out. They're not being challenged. They're being criminalized. They're being pipelined into prisons by not just community criminal justice institutions, but school-based criminal justice institutions. I invoked Gardena at the beginning is because here is a campus that's emblematic of all that is wrong with the paramilitarization of public schools, where you have not just school police, but you have the local Gardena municipal police, then you have the LAPD on campus. And this is all that students see when they come to school. Rather than we've got this culturally responsive group that is organizing around issues in the community, or we've got a science club, or we've got a coding club. Students are being paramilitarized into oblivion, and that's what's fueling this push-out regime.
Could you speak to what you think people in this room or our group might do to affect any of this change? I mean, most of the people I think are going to agree with you.
Well, I would ask, what are you already doing? What networks are you connected to? What issues have you engaged with? What's been the history?
I'm sure there's a variety. So.
Right. So what's been your history and investment in, say, busting the prison pipeline? What's been the history and investment in, say, addressing the issues that Richard invoked in the question about the homeless epidemic here in Phoenix, Tempe, Mesa, what have you?
Maybe if you could be more specific and...
Well, I'm not here to provide you with a template and a recipe, okay? The issue is that if we're talking about being culturally responsive, we're talking about trying to coalition build, what is it that this particular, you got a whole building here, You've got, a packed room. What have you been organizing around with this group? What are some of the relevant issues that impact this local community? Start there. If we're talking about issues of racial and gender and sexual orientation justice, what are these issues? Next question. Hi.
I assume these are public schools that you're talking about.
Yes.
Is there any difference between these schools and, for example, the KIPP schools there?
Oh boy. Charter schools, another issue when it comes to the epidemic of push-up. Charter schools, as some of you may know, neoliberal enterprises, problematic when it comes to actually addressing issues for special needs students and students who are not coming from middle-class backgrounds. Most of them are not unionized. Many of them are being propped up and bankrolled by billionaires like Eli Broad, the Walmart Foundation, and the Gates Foundation. So they're a scourge, many of them, not all, in communities of color, because they are creaming. If you go to a charter school as a parent, you have to do a certain allotment of community and school-based service hours. If you are a parent, who is working around the clock and has, several children, to contend with and to raise, you're not going to be able to do that. If you are a teacher who's coming in and you have a family to support and you don't have benefits, from a prior job, you come into the situation where you are really at the mercy of administrators who may not deem you to be politically palatable. You don't necessarily have union representation. There's no protection. So there are a number of things that are problematic about the presence of charter schools in our communities and the belief that charter schools are somehow going to be an antidote to all that ails public education.
I wanted to ask, what have you found are some of the most effective methods for creating more leadership positions and for Black youth or youth of color?
Some of the most effective are what I've mentioned in this talk. Is, you have actual, organic, youth-based organizations at schools or at local nonprofits. Okay. Where you coalition build across lines of ethnicity, race, class, and sexual orientation. And you bring in, adult mentors with resources. You bring in adult mentors who are not just going to provide, financial resources, but also are going to be sustainable long-term leaders and mentors and direct young people, to opportunities, internship opportunities, scholarship opportunities, work-based opportunities, and other community-building opportunities.
In Richard's introduction, I'm a civil engineer, and I heard the words transit and transportation in his intro and in your bio. I've long been an advocate of improving transit and that transportation is a social investment for everyone. Can you expand on what work you've done with respect to transit and transportation as it affects minority communities? Yeah,
so my first book was looking at the Pacific Electric Railway, which was one of the largest railway systems in the nation in LA. And that's something that is not commonly known, because LA is so autocentric. A part of that research was looking at the degree to which you had not just highway infrastructure, that disempowered and displaced, people of color, but also you had these incipient fixed and light rail systems that were coming in and really undermining the bus system. So I did a lot of work with the Bus Riders Union in LA County, and they were advocating, for more resources, more funding, and obviously, more lines for the buses, in addition to, getting buses that were compressed natural gas buses, more environmentally friendly. And a lot of that work was done in the 1990s, but it's still a concern with regard to, the lack of real equitable, meaningful access to public transit in LA, which is this very highway-oriented, very car, sprawling city. So we still have these issues in, the nexus of environmental racism and segregation. Okay, is there someone else besides, because you've spoken already, just wanted to give someone else a chance. Yes?
Could you discuss some alternatives to policing, in response to generally conflict, but sometimes criminal activity?
So there's a restorative justice movement that's afoot in the United States, to try and give communities that have been heavily impacted by criminalization some, type of purchase and ownership on equitable policing, if you will, a more community-based model in terms of allowing people to do, patrols, to actually, participate, with police, when it comes to surveying, their neighborhoods, assessing potential conflicts, being on school campuses, as mentors and community advisors. I'm not sure what's happening here in Arizona, but restorative justice is sort of a big watchword within Los Angeles Unified School District, and it's something that's been implemented on a student level in terms of doing circles and conflict mediation and resolution to try and disrupt the police presence so that you have buy-in, among students about, trying to maintain more healthy relationships on their campuses that fend against having all this paramilitary hardware on schools.
I don't know whether you're prepared to deal with this, but I'll ask it anyway. I am of the understanding that a lot of young African-American males get exposed to Muslim philosophy either through the criminal justice system or through recruits in certain areas. And when you say that some of the black youth are leaving their churches for more humanistic opportunities, there are, according to some of the documentaries I've watched, and I don't know how accurate they are, quite a few young men especially are being attracted to the Muslim faith. And I was wondering if you've done any research to find out how that's going to make your work a little bit more challenging.
Well, I wouldn't say that that's perspective. I mean, it's always been the case that the Nation of Islam has been attracted, to young black men. I mean, it's a nationalist organization. There's an emphasis on self-determination and self-respect. For me, it's problematic because it's sexist and misogynistic in many iterations. But it has that cultural appeal because it is training young black men and boys to have respect for the community, to move towards independent solutions, to question white supremacy. So there are a number of ideological attractions that the Nation of Islam has for young men of color.
So you talked about minority dropout or push out, whichever term you want to use. Have you done any work to get these minority kids to understand that there is a long-term consequences of either that dropping out or push out that make them understand what is the consequence of getting out of school? Do they know it? Is there work? Have you done any work in that field?
You mean in terms of instilling awareness among?
Yes, awareness.
Yeah,
among,
sure,
yeah.
sure. I mean that's part of the curriculum of the Young Male Scholars Program. Absolutely. But my caveat would be is that sure you can understand sort of theoretically the consequences, but when you see a lot of people in the community who have not gone to college, who have no pathway to college, then a certain amount of despair and negativity sets in. So it requires constant reinforcement, that this is a goal that is doable, that's accessible, and we are going to help you as adults move along that path. In the back.
So I'm wondering about your prison pipeline, how it would be affected by the war on drugs and the corporations that run prisons, and perhaps we're seeing a little bit of erosion of that, and how you can maybe interrupt that prison pipeline by, it seems to me that quite a large population of the prison is because of this war on drugs. This is the thing that happens, people do to themselves, it doesn't really affect anybody else. Any thoughts about how you might use that or how you might use that trend to help yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the state of California, for example, Proposition 47 was just passed, and that was designed to redress the disproportionate incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders, to allow nonviolent drug offenders, who have had felonies, to basically get those expunged. And certainly there's a movement afoot, to try and dismantle mandatory minimum sentencing policies that disproportionately impact nonviolent offenders. So that's a key part of this, in addition to the restorative justice measures that I mentioned. So, there is obviously a gradual movement that has been facilitated by thinkers and activists like Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, to try and redress these destructive draconian policies. Yes? One here.
I just wanted to build on what this gentleman said about communicating to young people the long-term consequences of dropout or push-out. And that is a phenomenon that we have here of the families themselves pressuring children to drop out when they're 16 to go get a job and support the family in this very near term. And I guess this is really more a comment, but maybe you can add to the observation that the outreach needs to be to more than just the students. It needs to be to their families too, for them to see that this short-term vision really interrupts the long-term vision for.
Yeah, I mean the issue is, you can proselytize all you want, but are you doing the rubber meets the road work to provide these young people and their families and the community at large with opportunities, and to make them visible, and to try and affect some type of paradigm shift when it comes to their thinking about the long-term benefits of going to college, when there has not been a palpable college-going tradition in their families or communities. And when they see, as per the stat that I put on the screen 20 minutes ago, that you have African-American college graduates who are grossly underemployed. So what does that signify, to a young person who's first generation?
You talked very much about college, and I did hear you mention the trade school, I think once. I'm wondering if going to a trade school is also being stressed in your program. Some young people just are not college material. The whole concept of working in an office just doesn't quite fit with them. And the money that they can make in some of the trades is just wonderful. It's a good, honest job. And I don't mean that just for people of color or any of it. I mean for everybody. I think trade schools should be offered along with college.
Right. The problem with that is that there used to be, and there probably still is, in some municipalities, a vocational track and a college track. And who typically would be consigned to that vocational track? It'd be black and brown students. So the issue is that, of course, trades are important. That kind of practical, hands-on, early orientation is important. But the reality is we're talking about the long-term income implications that for African American, Latino young people, the wealth gap is so staggering for those who do not go to college that the two have to be in tandem. Yes, if there are vocational opportunities that are available and that make sense in the community, we are going to ensure that they're aware of them and that they can get prepared. But there's also going to be that strong emphasis on college readiness and college preparation. Because if we look at the trajectory, of income and social mobility for people of color, college is unfortunately the linchpin. Having at bare minimum an undergrad degree is going to be a linchpin. You can look at all the data that shows you that a high school white male dropout, over time, can potentially make far more than an African American male college graduate. I mean, there's been a lot of data that attests to that concludes that. So yes, the two have to operate in tandem in terms of public policy and engagement with young people about their consciousness.
Based on all the work that you've done and some of the information you shared just now too, how optimistic or encouraged are you, especially with today's political climate, about progress and moving forward?
I'm encouraged. I mean, certainly we've seen the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is youth-led, which is queer-led, which is led, by African-American women. In the local LA community, we work with a number of, youth-oriented community activists, social justice organizations. So our youth have had a really signal opportunity, to be engaged at the grassroots level with a lot of the issues that I mentioned. So I have something of a well of optimism around there being true redress.
Are your youth being energized to register and vote and get their friends to register and vote? Because that's the bottom line, as far as I can see, in changing this country.
Yeah, and we do that.
Both Bernie and Ted Cruz think there's a vast number of people out there that are willing to follow them. I sure as hell hope it doesn't go for Ted Cruz, but I want the people. We've got to change.
Right.
We've got to change, and the only way we really change is by our vote, and this state needs it.
Yeah.
Would you mind repeating questions when the people on the front ask so that we can hear what they're saying?
Sure.
Thank you.
And you.
And I will speak very loudly, so hopefully you won't have to do that. So over the last couple of years, we've had a number of instances in the news media that have gotten a lot of coverage, lethal confrontations between law enforcement and people of color. And the kind of mass coverage, media coverage that we've gotten from those instances and from the after effects, do you feel like that's helping your cause or hurting your cause, or what's your perception of what the effect of that is?
Well, I think it's absolutely helping. It helps in terms of the pedagogy with youth. I mean, when we address these issues, there's a lot more awareness that they can actually invoke names of young people of color, who've been killed by law enforcement or brutalized, by law enforcement. Tremendous help in terms of just critical consciousness awareness raising. Absolutely. I'm going to take one more because I actually have to head out for the airport within about 10, 15 minutes. So, yeah. No, they're books. That's what I'm saying. I mean, one more question and then maybe we have questions up here. This is like 11:10 now. Someone who hasn't spoken? Yeah.
I feel guilty taking the last one, but I'm almost have disbelief when you told me that a college grad black person can attain less than somebody that's not a college grad. And I'm asking, how does that happen? Because in my mind, if they chose like an engineering degree or a programming degree, they would raise just as high as a white person, kind of. Like, is there really a real problem there, other than maybe just a little bit of bias? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a lot of bias. It's not a little bit of bias.
I just want to understand how that happens.
Well, it happens because of institutional racism and white supremacy and the belief that African Americans are not capable of doing well in certain occupations. There's also this issue of African Americans applying for jobs and, there being a quote-unquote ethnic name on a resume. You got all these degrees up the ass, and you can't even get a callback for a job, because you're instantly marked as being, this African American person, who's going to be problematic in a corporate professional workplace. And there's been a lot of data on that. I would suggest going and doing a search in the New York Times database. I think it was the Department of Labor, and they actually did, some survey on that, looking at the bias that's imposed upon African American job applicants.
It's appalling, is what it is. That's the response.
Yeah, and again, we're talking about educated African Americans with multiple college degrees. And if we look at the STEM field, I mean, I can't even get started talking about the rank bias in the STEM field. When it comes to attainment of jobs and mobility and promotion in, say, engineering. and other science and technology related fields. It's Paul. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. Okay, so we are going to have some books for sale up here, and she is going to do signing. So come on up, and you can ask her questions while she's signing books as well. Thank you, everybody. Come on up.